While diplomats were still sitting at the table, still talking about peace, still using the word ceasefire like it meant something, Iran fired missiles at United States Navy warships. Not one missile, not a warning shot, a full coordinated strike. Missiles, drones, fast attack boats, all three simultaneously, inside the Strait of Hormuz. And in the hours that followed, the world changed, quietly, dangerously, possibly permanently. This is US Global Lens, where power shifts are decoded before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this now, because what we are about to break down is something the mainstream coverage is already getting wrong. Here's what you need to understand before anything else. This was not a reaction. This was not frustration. This was not impulsive. What happened inside the Strait of Hormuz in the last 24 hours was a calculated, precisely timed, three-vector military operation executed during a period of active ceasefire negotiations. And that detail, that single detail, changes everything about how we read this moment. Because if Iran reacted, that is one story. If Iran planned this, that is an entirely different world. And the intelligence coming out of CENTCOM right now is pointing very heavily toward the second explanation. Let us set the scene exactly as it unfolded, because the sequence of events matters more than any individual headline. 3 United States Navy destroyers were conducting a standard transit through the Strait of Hormuz. This is one of the most heavily monitored waterways on the planet, roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Nearly 40% of the world's seaborne oil flows through it, and it sits between Iran to the north and Oman and the UAE to the south. When US warships move through the strait, everyone knows. Iran knows. Their radar systems know. Their Revolutionary Guard naval units know. Their missile batteries along the northern coastline know. There are no surprises in the Strait of Hormuz, which is exactly why what happened next was not a surprise on Iran's side. It was a decision. The attack came in 3 layers, and the layering is what military analysts are pointing to as the most alarming signal of all. The first wave was ballistic and cruise missile fire, launched from Iranian positions along the northern coastline. The second wave was unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, approaching from a different vector, a different angle, designed to divide the ship's defensive systems between 2 simultaneous threats. And the third element was fast attack boats, small, agile, heavily armed Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps naval vessels moving at high speed toward the destroyers from a third direction. Think about what that means operationally. To execute 3 simultaneous attack vectors against hardened military targets requires real-time coordination across multiple command nodes. It requires pre-positioning of assets. It requires rehearsal. It requires a decision made well before the moment of launch. Military analysts are already warning that the level of synchronization observed during this engagement does not reflect a spontaneous escalation. It reflects a pre-planned operation. And that is where things begin to get deeply, deeply serious. But that is not the real problem. The real problem is what this operation was actually designed to do. Because here is the truth that is being missed in the initial wave of reporting. Iran did not launch this attack to sink US destroyers. Think about it clearly. If Iran genuinely wanted to sink 3 US Navy destroyers, the Strait of Hormuz gives them some geographic advantages. But the United States Navy's defensive systems, its CIWS, its electronic countermeasures, its interceptor missile arrays, are among the most advanced anti-missile and anti-drone systems ever deployed on surface vessels. Iran knew the attack would be intercepted. Iran knew CENTCOM would respond. Iran knew US forces would strike back. They launched knowing all of that. So why launch? Because the attack was never about the destroyers. The attack was about the ceasefire. Here is where you need to understand the strategic architecture of what was already happening diplomatically. In the days preceding this engagement, the ceasefire between the broader regional parties, already described by President Trump himself as being on, in his words, massive life support, was teetering. Negotiations were continuing, but they were fragile. Every party at the table knew the ceasefire was not holding in any meaningful operational sense. And Iran made a calculation, a specific, dangerous, and coldly rational calculation. The calculation was this: what happens to American domestic politics if a US warship is struck during a ceasefire? What happens to Trump's political position? What happens to his ability to maintain the narrative that American power is respected, that deterrence is working, that the diplomatic track is producing results? The answer is that it collapses, and Iran is banking on that collapse. Let us walk through the specific trap that has been set, because this is the most important part of everything we are going to discuss today, and it needs to be understood in full. Trump's political identity on foreign policy has rested on a specific claim. The claim is that strength produces respect, that military and economic pressure on adversaries leads to compliance, that deterrence works when America is seen as willing to use overwhelming force. That is the framework. And within that framework, a ceasefire negotiated under American pressure is presented as a win, as proof that the strategy is working, as evidence that Iran is being brought to heel. That is the domestic narrative. Now, Iran strikes U.S. warships during that ceasefire. Trump now faces two options, and this is where everything breaks down. Option one, he retaliates massively. He orders CENTCOM to strike Iranian military infrastructure at a scale that goes far beyond the initial response already executed. He escalates. He restarts what was supposed to be a de-escalating situation. But if he does that, the ceasefire is not just dead, he killed it. He is now the president who took a situation that was winding down and turned it into a regional war. The political damage domestically and the strategic damage internationally from that choice is significant. His base may cheer a strike, but the broader American public, watching oil prices spike, watching markets react, watching the possibility of a protracted military engagement materialize, that is a very different political equation. Option two, he absorbs the hit. He lets CENTCOM's initial response stand as sufficient. He calls it a measured, proportionate reply. He tries to hold the ceasefire narrative together. But if he does that, the question every adversary on the planet is asking, every analyst, every defense ministry, every intelligence service, is the same question. Did Iran just strike 3 U.S. warships and face consequences that did not change the strategic equation? Did America blink? And once that question is in the air, deterrence begins to erode. Not just against Iran, against every actor watching to see how America responds when directly struck during a supposed period of diplomatic progress. Iran knows both of these options. Iran designed the attack around both of these options. That is the trap. And the reason Trump has gone silent is because there is no clean exit from it. Intelligence reports suggest that the White House has been in emergency consultation with CENTCOM, with the National Security Council, and with senior diplomatic advisors for the better part of the last 12 hours. The silence from the administration is not confusion. It is the sound of a decision being made under conditions where every available choice carries a serious cost. And this is where things get worse, because while the White House is calculating its response, the second and third order effects of this engagement are already moving through the global system, whether American decision makers are ready for them or not. The Strait of Hormuz, as we noted, carries roughly 40% of the world's seaborne oil. When military engagements occur inside that corridor, even ones that do not result in sunken ships, the insurance and risk calculations for every commercial vessel transiting the strait change immediately. Shipping companies are already rerouting. Lloyd's and other major maritime insurers have dramatically increased war risk premiums for vessels transiting the strait. Oil tanker operators are making the same calculation that they always make when the strait feels dangerous. We wait or we go around. Going around means the Cape of Good Hope. The Cape of Good Hope adds weeks to a journey and massive costs to a cargo. And when tanker operators wait or reroute, oil supply tightens. And when oil supply tightens, prices rise. And when prices rise, every major economy on the planet feels it within days. This is not a future scenario. This is already beginning to happen as these words are being spoken. Brent crude moved sharply within hours of the engagement becoming public. The move was not catastrophic, not yet, but the directional signal is clear, and the trajectory is what matters. Because if this engagement is followed by additional incidents, if the strait remains operationally unsafe for commercial traffic, the economic consequence for the global economy is not a minor disruption. It is a supply shock. And supply shocks in an already fragile post-pandemic, post-inflationary global economic environment have cascading effects that extend far beyond the price of oil. They hit inflation. They hit consumer sentiment. They hit central bank calculations. They hit political stability in importing nations. They hit the strategic calculus of every government that relies on Middle Eastern energy flows to keep its domestic economy functional. China imports more oil through the Strait of Hormuz than any other nation on Earth. India is number 2. Japan is critically dependent on Gulf energy flows. South Korea, the European nations that still purchase Gulf oil, all of them are watching this engagement not as a distant geopolitical event, but as a direct threat to their economic stability. And each of them is now asking the same question. What is the United States going to do? What does American power actually mean in this moment? Because the answer to that question determines how they position themselves strategically over the coming months. Military analysts are already warning that we are in a situation where the regional dynamic has fundamentally shifted. Before this engagement, the operating assumption, even within the uncertainty of fragile ceasefire talks, was that Iran was constrained, that the threat of American military response, combined with the economic pressure of sanctions, was producing a ceiling on Iranian action, that there was a line Iran would not cross because the cost of crossing it was too high. That assumption is now being stress-tested in real time. Because Iran crossed a very significant line, striking U.S. Navy vessels in international waters during an active ceasefire, and the immediate CENTCOM response, while damaging to Iranian military infrastructure, has not yet produced the kind of strategic cost that would clearly signal to Tehran that the calculation was wrong. And until that signal is unambiguous, Iran's strategic calculus remains in flux, which means the possibility of a second operation, a follow-on probe to see how far the ceiling has actually moved, cannot be dismissed. Defense experts understand that what Iran executed in the Strait was not a final move. It was a probe, a test, a carefully calibrated piece of intelligence collection disguised as a military operation. What they learned is what they needed to learn. How fast does CENTCOM respond? Which defensive systems activate first? What is the diplomatic reaction time? How long before Washington speaks publicly? What does Trump say versus what do his military commanders say? All of that information is being processed inside Iranian military and intelligence structures right now, and the conclusions they draw from it will shape their next move. But that is not the real problem either. The real problem is what is happening on the other side of the equation, because Iran did not act in isolation. Iran never acts in isolation, and the intelligence picture emerging around this engagement includes signals that are deeply concerning to analysts trying to map the full scope of what we are looking at. In the hours before the Strait engagement, there were communications intercepts, reported through defense intelligence channels, suggesting coordination between Iranian command structures and at least one additional regional actor. The specific nature of those communications has not been officially confirmed, but the timing, the content of what was intercepted, and the subsequent activation of certain military assets in adjacent theaters suggests that Iran was not operating alone in its planning, even if it was operating alone in its execution. What this means is that the engagement in the Strait of Hormuz may not be the primary operation. It may be the opening act. And this is where the scenario stops being a Middle East story and starts being a global one. Let us think through the options that are actually on the table for the United States right now, because this matters, and let us be honest about each of them, because none of them are clean. Option 1, as we discussed, is massive retaliation. Strike Iranian military infrastructure at a scale that is unmistakably disproportionate. Make the cost so high that Iran's leadership has to recalculate whether further probing is worth the price. The logic of this option is deterrence restoration. The problem is that escalation in the Strait of Hormuz, at scale, risks exactly the thing every party claims to want to avoid, a broader regional war. It also risks direct Iranian retaliation against U.S. assets in Iraq, Syria, and the broader region, potential activation of Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the collapse of any remaining diplomatic architecture in the region. Option 2 is proportionate response and diplomatic re-engagement. Strike the specific assets used in the attack. Damage Iran's capacity to repeat repeat the operation. Then, use diplomatic backchannels to signal that the door to negotiation remains open if Iran stands down. The logic here is damage limitation. The problem is that Iran has already demonstrated it can absorb proportionate responses and continue probing. A proportionate response may not restore deterrence, it may simply be absorbed as the cost of doing business. Option 3 is economic escalation. Maximum pressure, full sanctions enforcement, secondary sanctions against any nation trading with Iran, coordinated with allies, squeeze the Iranian economy hard enough that the domestic cost of continued military adventurism becomes politically unsustainable for the Iranian leadership. The problem with this option is time. Economic pressure works slowly. Markets and oil prices will not wait for slowly applied economic pressure to produce behavioral change in Tehran. And Iran has shown historical resilience to sanctions-based pressure. Painful, yes, but not sufficient to change strategic direction quickly. Option 4 is coalition building. Bring partners into the response. Build a multilateral framework for enforcing safe passage through the strait. Bring Gulf partners, European allies, Asian energy importers together under a shared security architecture. The problem here is that most of those partners are watching the U.S. response to this engagement to determine whether American security guarantees are worth aligning with. If America looks uncertain, hesitant, or politically paralyzed, the coalition option weakens precisely when it is needed most. Option 5 is negotiation from this position. Use the military response already executed as leverage. Go back to the table with a demonstrated willingness to escalate, but an explicit offer to de-escalate if Iran recommits to ceasefire terms. The problem is that Iran has just demonstrated that military action during ceasefire talks is a viable tool for shifting negotiating conditions. Rewarding that behavior, even implicitly, by rushing back to the table creates a perverse incentive for exactly the kind of probe and negotiate strategy that Iran appears to be executing. Every option carries a cost. Every option contains a failure point. And the truth that nobody in Washington wants to say out loud is exactly this. There is no good option here. There are only options with different kinds of damage, and the choice between them will define not just the outcome in the Strait of Hormuz, but the shape of American power in the Middle East for the next decade. And now let us zoom out even further, because this moment, right now, these hours, is not just about the Strait of Hormuz. It is about a much larger question that is being answered in real time. We are living through a period in which the post-World War II order, the system of alliances, norms, institutions, and deterrence relationships that has structured global security for 80 years, is under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered the assumption that great power territorial aggression was no longer viable. China's posture toward Taiwan is testing the limits of American extended deterrence in the Pacific. North Korea's continued missile development program is stress testing the non-proliferation architecture. And now Iran, in the Strait of Hormuz, is testing whether American deterrence in the Middle East is real or performative. These are not separate stories, they are connected. Every actor watching every other actor. Every probe of American resolve in one theater being processed by decision makers in every other theater. When China's leadership watches how Trump responds to Iran striking U.S. warships, they are drawing conclusions about how Trump would respond to a move on Taiwan. When Russia's military planners watch the American political paralysis in the hours after the Strait engagement, they are recalibrating their assessment of American will in Europe. When North Korea watches the options debate playing out in Washington, they are learning something about the limits of American capacity to manage simultaneous crises. This is why what happens in the next 72 hours is not just about Iran. It is about the credibility of the entire global security architecture. It is about whether deterrence still works. It is about whether the signal that American military presence sends to adversaries around the world is a signal of consequence or a signal of manageable cost. Defense analysts understand that we are at an inflection point. Not a crisis, an inflection point. A moment where the trajectory changes, where what happens next determines not just the immediate outcome, but the slope of everything that follows. The decisions made in Washington in the next 72 hours will echo for years, not because of their immediate immediate military effect, but because of what they signal to every actor in every theater watching to see what American power actually means when it is directly challenged. And this changes everything, not because of the attack itself, but because of what comes after. Because of the precedent being set, because of the information Iran, Russia, China, and every other strategic actor is collecting about American resolve, American political cohesion, and American willingness to absorb costs in defense of its stated red lines. The American public is watching oil prices, the American political class is watching Trump's response, the American military is waiting for orders. And simultaneously, in Tehran, in Beijing, in Moscow, in Pyongyang, in every capital where the calculation of what America will and will not do matters strategically, analysts are watching the silence from the White House and drawing their own conclusions. Here is what we know with clarity. The ceasefire is functionally over. Whether it is officially declared dead or not, whether diplomats continue to meet or not, the ceasefire as a meaningful operational constraint on Iranian military action has been destroyed by this engagement. Iran fired during the ceasefire. That is the fact. And a ceasefire that can be violated by a three-vector coordinated missile, drone, and naval attack against U.S. Navy destroyers is not a ceasefire. It is a fiction. A useful fiction for as long as both sides chose to maintain it. Iran has chosen not to maintain it, and that choice cannot be unmade by diplomatic language. What this means for the broader regional architecture is that every party who is operating under the assumption of ceasefire stability now has to recalibrate. The Gulf states who had quietly relaxed some of their defensive posture, the commercial shipping companies who had cautiously begun resuming straight transits, the energy markets that had partially priced in a stable near-term outlook, the diplomatic tracks in various capitals that were slowly building towards something more durable. All of that recalibration takes place simultaneously, all of it in an environment of uncertainty. All of it shaped by a central question that nobody can yet answer. What does America do next? And Trump goes silent. That silence is itself a signal. Not necessarily the signal of weakness or confusion, though that is how adversaries will read it if it continues too long. It may be the silence of careful calculation. It may be the silence of a decision process that is genuinely wrestling with the complexity of options we have just walked through. But in geopolitics, silence is never neutral. Silence is always interpreted. And in a moment this significant, with adversaries and allies both watching, the interpretation of American silence is not being made by Washington. It is being made by Tehran, by Beijing, by Moscow, by every capital that needed to know whether America blinks. The coming hours will tell us something we have not known with certainty before. Whether American deterrence in the post-ceasefire Middle East holds. Whether the political will exists in Washington to absorb short-term costs in service of long-term strategic credibility. Whether the framework that has kept the Strait of Hormuz, and by extension 40% of global seaborne oil, functionally open under American security guarantee, still has teeth. Or whether we are watching the beginning of a new equilibrium. A world in which Iran has demonstrated that America can be struck during a ceasefire, that the political consequences of striking back are complex enough to produce hesitation, and that hesitation is enough to create space for further action. Because here is the question that nobody in the mainstream coverage is asking directly. If Iran probed during the ceasefire and survived the probe, if the immediate cost was manageable and the diplomatic fallout was containable, what exactly is the deterrent that prevents a second probe? What is the line that Iran now believes it cannot cross, given that it just crossed the line it was not supposed to cross, and the world has not yet moved decisively to reset that boundary? And here is the second question. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes genuinely contested, if commercial shipping cannot transit it safely, if energy markets face a sustained supply shock, if the global economic consequences begin to accumulate, at what point does this stop being a regional geopolitical crisis and becomes a global economic emergency? At what point do the interests of China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Europe, all of them dependent on Gulf energy flows, pull them into the strategic equation in ways that further complicate American decision-making? And the third question, the one that sits underneath all of it, are we watching the beginning of a new world order being born through conflict? Are we watching the stress test that determines whether the American-led security architecture survives into the next decade, or whether it fractures along the lines of pressure being applied simultaneously from multiple directions? Is the silence from the White House the silence before a decisive response that restores deterrence and reshapes the regional equation? Or is it the silence that gets remembered years from now as the moment the old order began to break? We do not have those answers yet. Nobody does. But what we know, what the intelligence picture, the military analysis, the strategic logic all point toward, is that we are in one of those rare moments where the decisions of the next 72 hours genuinely matter, where the path taken determines a trajectory that will be felt for years, where the world is, for just a moment, holding its breath, waiting to see what America does, waiting to see whether deterrence is real, waiting to see whether the balance of power that has structured the modern world is still intact, or whether something has quietly, dangerously, irreversibly shifted. Because if it has shifted, if this is the moment the signal changes, then everything that comes after is a different world, a more dangerous world, a world where the rules are being rewritten by the actors willing to fire first and calculate the consequences later, a world where the Strait of Hormuz is not a guaranteed passage, but a contested corridor, where American warships are not an untouchable deterrent, but a target to be probed and tested, where ceasefire means nothing if one party decides it means nothing. And that world, if that is the world we are entering, changes everything. If this breakdown gave you something the headlines missed, share it, subscribe, and stay with US Global Lens, because this story is not over, and the next move will be the one that defines what comes after.